Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card is considered one of the finest works of the science fiction genre. It won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards and is one of my personal top 2 books in this genre. If you want to find out if it's 1 or 2, you got to watch the video. Or I guess you could skip to the end. But please watch the video. I really want to talk about this with all of you. This is a book that's handed out at military academies. This is a book that at my previous school was taught to 9th grade English. And it's such a great work because it's a great work of science fiction, but it has a lot more thematic elements that are more thought-provoking, and it's just a supremely compelling narrative. So this is going to be a spoiler-free and spoiler discussion, but I will save all my spoilers for a section towards the end. So if you've not read Ender's Game, and you might want to, you can skip over the spoiler section and just skip to my wrap-up at the very end. I hope that there's one person somewhere that watches this video and is compelled to read Ender's Game, because that's the biggest reason why I'm making these videos, is I hope that I can spread the books that I love to others. So this was also a read-along for my channel, so if you're here for the read-along, or if you've simply read Ender's Game, please blow up the comment section below. I really want to talk about a lot of the more thought-provoking themes in this book, and just want to see what you thought of it. Is it a masterpiece like I think? Did you not like it? I'm just really interested in what you have to say about this, so please drop me a comment below. And of course, like, subscribe, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so in the spoiler-free section, I'm going to break this down into 3 parts, as I do with most of the book reviews that I do. I will talk about first why I decided to read it. In this case, why I decided to reread this book. The second thing that I'll do is I'll break down what it's about, including analyzing plot, character, and setting. Then I'll talk about the deeper themes. Then I'll talk even deeper about all of that in the spoiler section, but I will give you a timestamp that you can skip ahead if you want to skip the spoiler section. Because there's a lot in this book, I have a little outline, so if you see me occasionally looking down to see what's on my outline, it's just because there's so many things I want to talk about. I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything. So let's go ahead and start with, why did I decide to reread this book? Well, last year, Orson Scott Card came out with The Last Shadow, which is a book that is supposed to conclude both the 5 books, the Ender Quintet, as they call them, that series, as well as Ender's Shadow series, which takes place concurrently with those books. And this 11th book is supposed to wrap up all of those books. So it's been about a decade since I read Ender's Game and the 5 books that follow Ender. The Shadow series I've read more recently, but I thought it'd be great to make sure that before I read The Last Shadow, just to get caught up, reread these books and to see, what I liked about them, if I still love them as much as I did, when I first read them. So I'm reading 1 per month, and it is a read-along on the channel. If you want to continue, we'll be doing Ender's Shadow next month, because chronologically in the world, that makes a little bit more sense to jump to that, but I'll talk about that more at the end. So that's basically why I decided to reread. My initial read of this book was, why are they having my 9th graders read science fiction? I wish when I was in 9th grade, I was forced to read science fiction. I don't remember what I was forced to read, but I know that I probably didn't like it. I would have loved to have been able to be reading and discussing and talking about a work of science fiction in 9th grade. So I wanted to read this to find out why this was a book that was pushed onto 9th graders as required reading. And when I read it, and especially when I just reread it and I saw all of the deeper themes in here, it is something that I realized it's a great book to teach. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that's the reason why I decided to dip the toe back into the waters with this book. So what is it about? So Ender's Game takes place 80 years after Earth is invaded. Earth was invaded by an alien race called the Buggers, and they call them the Buggers only because they're unable to communicate with them, and they looked insectoid. So because of this, they had to name this alien race, and they called them the Buggers. Well, the Buggers outmanned, outgunned humanity, but humanity had a superior military commander by the name of Mazer Rackham. Only through his cunning and guile were they able to fight off this bugger invasion. So in the meantime, humanity has been looking for that last great military commander, because they feel that they're facing an enemy superior to them, superior technology, superior weaponry, superior numbers of people. And they're looking for this great new military commander. And over the generations, they've started recruiting younger and younger. So at the point where Ender enters the story here, 80 years have passed since that first invasion. Ender's about 5 years old, and they're recruiting their commanders, potential commanders, that young. What they're looking for is they're looking for children that have a high IQ, but have the temperament to be a great military leader, but also someone that they can mold into this great military commander. So the story starts with Andrew Ender Wiggin, and Ender is what we call a third. And this is only the first chapter, so just minor spoilers for the first chapter. A third is the third child of a family. In the futuristic Earth where this is set, that's not allowed because of, overpopulation, limited resources. Families are limited to just 2 children. But Ender is a third because both of his older siblings have extremely high IQs, and this international fleet thought that maybe the third child would be this great military commander. The reason that Ender's siblings did not get into this elite program is they just didn't have the temperament for various reasons to be accepted into this program. So Ender's parents were encouraged or possibly forced to have a third child in the hopes that this might be humanity's last hope for this great military commander that they were searching for. So at the beginning of this book, we see Colonel Graff, who is one of the military commanders in charge of training and finding that great leader that they're looking for. And we see him evaluating Ender. It's not a spoiler to say, if you just look on the back and you understand, chosen one tropes, that Ender will get accepted into this battle school on this space station. And that's where the bulk of this story takes place. And that's all the plot I'm going to talk about in the spoiler-free section, because a lot of things happen that I don't want to give away, that I hope that you read and discover them for yourselves. Let's talk about the setting a little bit. So the setting is a futuristic Earth, and more specifically, it's on this space station that feels much like the stories that you hear about, like boot camp with, military stories. It just happens to be indoors, but you get the barracks and all of the little sub platoons and things like that you would get in a military story. So I can see one reason why this is encouraged in, military academies to read, because there's a lot of parallels there. And of course, the training and what the military is trying to do and to produce with these children, I think would hit home for, a new grunt or whatever they're called as they're experiencing this, to be reading Ender's Game and experiencing this kind of story is a lot of parallels into what they would do. There's a minimal amount of world building going on. This is not on par with, Dune up here as far as, this massive world and universe building. But I will say that there's a lot more there than meets the eye. I do feel that, having read the sequels, just about all the little seeds are planted by Card in this book. And it may seem minimal, but a lot of the little things that you're told about in the world and the universe, pays dividends down the line. So if you thought there was not a lot of world building, there's more in there than meets the eye, but it's not on par with, Frank Herbert's Dune or something like that, which coincidentally is probably the only book that I'll compare this to in this discussion, because those are the 2 greatest works of science fiction that I've read. So that's the only worthy comparison that I can think of for Ender's Game, in my opinion. One more aspect of the setting is it is a futuristic Earth, and I'm always compelled by an author what they think Earth is going to be like in the future. Are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? What do they think of how countries and nations now, will they combine? Will they still be separate entities? And I found it very interesting how Card, his vision of what this futuristic Earth looks like. So that was one compelling part of the setting as well. And I generally enjoy more of these science fiction tales that do have a basis in our own Earth. I think it grounds them a bit more, and it gives us something to latch onto, knowing that, well, that's still our world rather than everything is brand new. So I appreciate that this is just a futuristic Earth, and I enjoy the setting quite a bit. All right, let's talk about characters next. So 80% of the book is told from Ender's point of view, so you get quite a bit of Ender. So let's look at the secondary characters first that we see quite a bit more, starting with Ender's siblings. Ender's older brother, Peter, is 4 years older than him, and he's the typical cruel, older brother trope that you see in a lot of fiction, not just science fiction. And the thing that struck me with Peter on this reread is he's a lot more sadistic than I remembered. Maybe I just glossed over, or over time it softened a bit, but man, Peter is cruel to Ender, especially when he sees that Ender gets accepted into this elite military program that Peter was denied entry into. So, Peter is kind of a rough element of Ender's life. Ender's older sister Valentine is 2 years older than him, and Valentine is the only person that Ender loves, the only person that Ender trusts, and the only person that he feels loves him for who he is. His older brother obviously doesn't. He feels that his parents are kind of embarrassed by him because he's the third child, and that's something that's not accepted in this society. And in fact, when Ender goes to space, that's the last time that we see Ender with his parents, because they're almost aloof at him being sent away. They're, in a way, almost relieved. So Valentine is his one confidant, the one person he loves and trusts in his life. And given what's going to go on in this book, you're so thankful that there is this Valentine in his life, because a lot of horrible things happen to Ender in this book. There's a lot of dark scenes in this book, but knowing he has at least that one person in his court is a bright of, positivity in Ender's life. So some of the other people in the book, there are a lot of the other children that are in this International Fleet School. But a lot of them, even though they're in the entire book, they're kind of kept at arm's length, because you start to see early on that the military commanders think that Ender is the one. So they're working very hard to turn him into this elite commander. And one way they have to do that is they have to isolate him. So even though early on he makes some friends at flight school, they really start to isolate him. And you see these people more as, I guess, more on the lines of colleagues than friends. So they're in the book, but they're not, quite in the foreground of the storytelling, but as people that are around Ender's orbit. And the last group of secondary characters that I think are important is really just Colonel Graff and the other commanders, Graff being the most important. He only gets, I think, 2 or 3 point of view chapters or sections of chapters in this book, but you get more glimpses into him at the beginning of each chapter. At the beginning of each chapter, you get an epigraph that is a conversation between Colonel Graff and one of the other commanders talking about their training methods of Ender and the other recruits. And you often see arguments between them. Graff takes his job very seriously, and because of that, he puts Ender through a lot of horrible situations that, the other commanders often disagree with what he's doing. But you start to see the motivations of these commanders and, frankly, their manipulations of these children in trying to make the best out of them. So that's kind of the last group of characters in the story. So let's move on to the deeper themes in this book, because there are so many of them, and this is what, for me, makes this such a superior work of science fiction compared to a lot of the things that I've read. The first big theme, probably the main one, might as well start with that, is the thought of individualism versus collectivism. They are training children. Did I mention that Ender's 5 years old when he's recruited to the IF school? So they're training children in these military methods. And this book takes place over a decade. So you see over the span of these 10 years or so, just what these children are subjected to. You see some of them not make it and are fundamentally broken. So the big question that I feel this book asks is, what's more important, the individual or the collective? Is it okay to destroy a couple hundred children in the name of finding this one military commander that's going to save all of humanity, the billions of people in the world? When you look at it as a simple math, equation, it's pretty easy. Yes, it's okay to destroy these 100 kids if we're going to save 80 billion or however many are on Earth in this futuristic world. But what if you're that child? What if that child is your child? Does that change your answer? So it's a really tough question, and I thought I had a firm answer until a plot turn towards the end made me reevaluate what my own beliefs in this topic of individual versus collective. If you want to hear more about that, I will talk about that more in length in the spoiler section. But it's a deep philosophical question. Is destroying one child okay if he saves 80 billion? I have my answer, which I'll give later in the video. This is fundamentally a coming-of-age tale, so that's one of the thematic elements. It's not the typical age of a coming-of-age tale. You know, age 5 to 15 is kind of, you figure that you're not of age yet at 15, but because of everything that Ender endures in this book, he feels very much like an adult at the end of this book, even though he's still 15 years old. He's mentally an adult, maybe not emotionally or physically at this point, but it is a very tough coming-of-age tale. You will have a lot of empathy for Ender and what he has to go through. The most recent time that I've encountered a character like this, where I felt so much empathy for a character, was Fitz in Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy. You just feel so bad for Ender, and you just want something to go right in his life, and you want some sort of positivity to happen to him, because so much of what he goes through and is subjected to by both the military commanders and the children in this flight school, you just feel so bad for him. You just hope that there's a ray of sunlight at the end of this tale for Ender. So one other theme I want to talk about is the precociousness of these children. And I only address this because the edition of the book I read this as the paperback, the author's definitive edition of Ender's Game. In his foreword, Orson Scott Card talks about how he was criticized for his portrayal of the children in this book, how they didn't feel like children, how they felt much older. Now, I won't dispute the fact that they feel older. Every time there was a time jump in this story, I always thought they were, 4 or 5 years older than it was eventually revealed in the book. So I won't refute that fact. But as far as these not feeling like children, I fundamentally disagree. As a teacher of very precocious children, some of these kids are so mentally advanced compared to where I was. And I was a precocious child. I was an only child growing up, and I was, pretty smart kid. I started reading when I was like 3 or something like that. So all through my childhood, I always felt like I was one of the adults. Erroneously, of course. I felt that, I was on the mental level of the adults in my life. Of course, that was all untrue, but I did feel that I was much older than the children I was around. Now, that was just small town me. Think about a precociousness on the level of a globe. You think of the absolute highest IQ, smartest, most mature kids with the right temperament for this program altogether, they're going to feel older. So I don't feel that that is unrealistically portrayed in this book, but I'd love to hear your take on it. So let me know in the comments below if you think that was unrealistic or not. Again, I do feel they felt older, but I don't feel that they were unrealistically portrayed. One aspect that I do feel that they were still portrayed as kids was just the emotional maturity, how when the lights would go out, you'd hear the kids crying, because they're still kids. That's still the biggest emotional coping mechanism that they have in their lives. So because of that, I still felt that you could see them as kids, even if the other times when the lights were on, when they were interacting with each other, thinking these supremely intelligent thoughts, they might not have felt like children to a lot of readers. But overall, this is Ender's story, how he deals with so much trauma in his life, how he comes through this, how he is sculpted into potentially this great military commander. That's where I'm going to stop the spoiler-free section. So I want to talk about spoilers. So I'm going to put up here a timestamp for you to skip to if you want to come to the wrap-up, which I hope you will, because I'm going to reveal there if this is number 1 or 2 in my mind in the science fiction genre. So skip to that. So I'm going to start spoilers in 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, you're in the spoiler section. You've been warned. Let's talk about Peter first. So is Peter a psychopath, or a minimum a sociopath? He was so much harsher than I remember the first time I read this book. And I found so realistic how he went into politics. This is not a political statement, but I firmly believe that 90% of people that go into politics go in for the power, not because they want to serve others. There is that small 10%, and that's people on both sides of the aisle, so don't make this a political discussion. I think that's very true about most politicians, that they're not there for service. They're there for power. And you see that how Peter manipulates himself into some power. If you want more of Peter's story, he factors into Ender's Shadow series quite a bit, which I'll be reading next. But man, Peter was at least a sociopath, how he even manipulated Valentine in the scenes that we get on Earth. And I find it so tragic that Ender just wanted Peter's love. And it's such a true dynamic of older brother, younger brother. And it really made me think about how many children's lives are ruined, at least temporarily, by having older siblings that they just want their approval, and these older siblings are not good people. I just wonder about that. I mean, how many lives are altered or even ruined by older siblings that are just frankly bad people? So horrible. I mean, such a horrible thing. Let's talk about Valentine, because the one scene that for me caused the most emotional trauma as a reader was when Valentine convinced, after Ender had killed Bonso in the shower and was on Earth, when Valentine convinced Ender to go back to space because humanity needed him. I glossed over this the first time I read it. I remembered that she talks him into going back, but what I didn't remember is how betrayed Ender felt by this. The one person in his life that loved him just betrayed him and did something for humanity that was against what was right for Ender. I found that so heartbreaking, because as isolated as Ender was on the space station, he's now even more so isolated because he doesn't feel that Valentine's with him anymore. And of all the horrible things that happen in this book, that's the one that hit me the most. The time that I felt the most for Ender, and felt so bad for Ender because he lost his sister at this point, at least in his mind. So, how do we feel about Ender being a two-time murderer? I mean, killing Bonso in the shower, that was justified because it was one of them. You know, if he didn't kill Bonso, Bonso was going to kill him. How did you feel, though, when you found out that in the opening scenes of the book that he didn't just beat up Stilson, but he killed Stilson? He didn't realize this at the time, and we as readers didn't realize this either. But does it change your thoughts about Ender as a character? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because it changed for me a little bit, the thoughts on Ender, but even more so, it changed the thoughts on why he got recruited into the program. And I asked myself the question, if he hadn't killed Stilson, would they have accepted him into the IF school? I'm really not sure. Because isn't what he did with Stilson what he does with the buggers at the end of the book? He fights that one fight, but he's not fighting that fight. He's fighting all the future fights. So he has to win so brutally and so categorically and so emphatically that there are no future fights. Was that single act, that fight, the reason that he got accepted into flight school? I tend to think it is. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But does it change your opinion on Ender, knowing that, you know, as a child, he killed another child? It's exactly what the military, I think, was looking for in their commander. Someone who was ruthless enough to know that they had to win this final battle. And as you see in the plot turns later, exactly what they were looking for. Let's talk about those plot turns next. The first time I read this book, I was so gobsmacked by that first plot turn when we find out that when they're on the space station, or not the space station, when they're on the moon, that they're no longer doing simulations. They thought all this time that they were running these simulations, they weren't simulations, but Ender and his team were truly commanding the fleet in the third invasion. When that was revealed to me, I was gobsmacked. I don't know if I just didn't see it coming, but it blew me away that first time around. When you realize that that last battle was the last battle, it was not a simulation, but Ender had been commanding all of these military troops. He had been commanding them. He had been sending people to their deaths, all in the name of winning these last battles. And my goodness, it blew me away. If this is new for you, I mean, were you as gobsmacked as I was? Because my goodness, it blew me away. But what I will say is the second kind of plot turn because the first one hit me so much the first time through, the second one didn't hit me as much, but hit me more this second time through, that the third invasion was not the invasion of the buggers invading Earth, but the Earth invading the buggers' homeworld in a preemptive strike to eliminate them so that they can't attack us anymore. That blew me away. That reveal blew me away even more the second time. And that leads me to what I think is the big theme here, where I talked about earlier about individualism versus collectivism. I was firmly on the side of the collective is more important until that plot turn. I was firmly on the side that we need a commander to defend ourselves. But when I saw that the military was not a defensive move, but they were engaged in an offensive move, a horrific offensive move, a horrifically successful offensive move that causes a genocide, I immediately changed my idea on the individual versus the collective towards destroying those hundreds of kids was not worth it for us to have done the act that we did. This horrific thing that destroys not just the buggers' fleet, but their entire homeworld, their entire species. I'd love to know what you think. Do you still think that it's the right thing, that the collective is more important than what they did to all these people? We see all the trauma that Ender's gone through. He's 15 years old at the end of this book, and you feel like he's lived a lifetime of just horrific events. And now he's armed with the horrific thought that he had been sending troops to their deaths, and he had just exploded a nuclear device on a homeworld that caused the destruction of an entire species. Is that worth it? I don't think it is. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. So the very end of the book, Ender finds the seedling or the egg or whatever that is. And again, it so changes the perspective of so much you thought when you find out that the invasions were simply a result of miscommunication, that they didn't think this was intelligent life. Oh my goodness. And it was so moving to me when you find out that there's still this consciousness. And what was most moving for me is, again, all this trauma that Ender's been through, that there's a glimmer of hope that maybe he can do right by finding a place for this seedling to grow and to maybe, repopulate the buggers' population and to restart this species again. And my goodness, we needed some hope at the end of this book because of everything that Ender went through. Ender, end of the book, exiled from Earth. He can never go back there again. Thankfully, he has his sister Valentine back with him, who decides to go with him. So there is some hope at the end of this book that is filled with such darkness. And I'll tell you, the emergence of that very end, I think the first time I read this book, I was just so blown away by that initial plot turn that I kind of glossed over a few of these things that I find so much more compelling and so much more thought-provoking now. The offensive versus the defensive action, and then this seedling, this glimmer of hope that maybe Ender can make things right. And it will be in the sequels. If you've read them or you decide to read them, you will see more of Ender trying to make right this genocide that he commanded on this bugger's homeworld. So that's it for spoilers. Listen, if you're in the spoiler section and you want to talk spoilers, please label those spoiler comment ahead or something like that in the comment section, because we don't want to ruin it for people that haven't read this book, especially the big reveals at the end of this book. I think it would really ruin things for someone if they came and they saw that. So please label your spoilers. All right, so on to the wrap up. Ender's Game is one of the most fantastic works in the science fiction genre. It has some of the deeper themes in the science fiction genre. It's one of the reasons I love the science fiction genre so much, is the ideas. It's not the setting in space, although I do enjoy that. It's these big ideas in these books that lead me back to this genre. That's why I love Dune so much, the deeper themes. That's why I love some of the works of, Asimov and some others quite a bit as well. But Ender's Game is simply one of the best. Is it my favorite? I don't know, honestly. I think Dune is number one, but just by a hair. There's just something about the world building in Dune that I just love. I love Arrakis and I love the Fremen, but these deep themes in Ender's Game are just, they're so compelling. They're so thought-provoking. So I'm not going to say that Ender's Game is number 2 on my list. I'm going to say Dune is 1, Ender's Game is 1A. They are certainly the 2 best works I've read in the science fiction genre. And I love this book. I'm so glad that I reread this book. And I'm glad that some of you reread this book with me. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So if you have not read the book, I've already instructed the people in the spoiler section to label their comments by spoilers. So try to avoid those as best as you can. But I do hope that if you do read the book, you can come back, look at the spoiler section, and join in on the discussion below. So where does Ender's Game rank for you? Is this, like me, one of your favorites of the science fiction genre? Did you find it was just pretty good, not great? Did you not like it? I'd love every comment with that. I hope that most of you loved it as much as I do, because I like to be positive and I like to talk about the books I love most. So I hope that you love this book, but even if you didn't, let me know in the comments section below. So next month I'll be reading Ender's Shadow. This is the first book of the Shadow series. And it works better, I think, because it's more chronological if you skip to the Shadow series next. It follows Bean, one of Ender's shipmates. And his coming-of-age tale is quite brilliant. And in fact, when I read the 2 series, I think I liked the Shadow series a little bit more than the Ender saga. So it'll be interesting on a reread if I agree with that. But a lot of this takes place concurrently with Ender's Game. So it's a good one to read right after Ender's Game if you just want more of this world. And you get to see Ender from Bean's perspective as well as Battle School from Bean's perspective, and a great origin story for him as well. So I will be posting a review on Ender's Shadow the last week of March. So you have until then to read Ender's Shadow if you want to be able to see the spoiler section in that review. But as always, like and subscribe if you have not already. Drop me a comment below what you thought of Ender's Game, what you thought of my assessment of Ender's Game. There's still a lot of things I didn't talk about, like, did Colonel Graff gain weight because he was so stressed out by what he was doing with Ender? Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this video. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.